Hello, everyone, and welcome back from lunch. Hope you managed to have a bit of a break. So this session is going to be an hour long, and we'll be joined again by Richard Hillsdon, and he'll be focusing this time on if you're application and interview ready. So again, Richard's going to speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end left for questions. And as before, just start sending your questions through as and when you think of them, and then we'll come to them all at the end. And as I mentioned before, all the slides and all the videos will be available next week. So yeah, you don't need to worry about if you've missed anything on the slides, you'll get them. Okay, so I will hand over to Richard.
Thank you, Emma, very much. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. It was quite a lot to take in beforehand, and I hope we managed to answer your questions as best as I could. And you can ask some more as we go, because remember, this is not a separate presentation. It's the second half of a whole presentation around those 9 steps. And I've still got several to do. I'll show you a slide just reminding where we've got to in just a moment. I want to just pause, though, and say, to reiterate what I said this morning, which is that this is all based on experience with people who've got through this process and people who've struggled with it. So I built it out of actual examples, hence the reason why I've shown 1 or 2 on the screen. So you must take this and do your own diagnosis of your readiness. And as I say, the intention is not, we can't provide certainty here, but I'm certain that the following, most of what I've said, will shift the dial quite a bit in terms of the probability of success. And I think you can see the rationale as we go. At least I'm trying to explain it as we go. But I don't expect you to agree with everything. You will have your own style and views and so on. And I'm not in any way trying to take that away from you. You don't have to agree with everything I say. So without more ado, let's bash on. There you are. There's the 9 steps. And we've still got the interview, and most of this is going to be around the interview, although I am going to talk about behaviour statements along the way quite a bit too, because behaviours, of course, are not just things that, although the advert I showed you this morning didn't include it, more often than not, you're going to get behaviours either to write up at the application stage and then be quizzed on at the interview should you get through, or behaviours that will appear only, you won't have written them up, at the interview. And so therefore you're going to talk to a particular behaviour, seeing the big picture or whatever it might be, from scratch in the interview. By the way, that makes the process totally different in lots of ways, as you would imagine. So that's something that you could ask me questions about if you want. Let's go on. Let's start with the poll question. I mean, you've had a chance to reflect on your approach, I suppose, from the session we had before lunch. And many of you will have not got through an interview. I realise there'll be probably many more of you who've not perhaps got through a SIF, but I'm focusing on the interview here. How easy was it to change your approach? And I've given you 4 possibilities here. You could probably add to others if you like, but let's go with those. One about feedback. Then there was about how you go about changing your performance. And then there was a question of whether you wanted to change your performance or whether you felt that, the panel were just wrong. And to be quite honest, I've come across that a lot. The panels, as in SIF panels, very often don't do enough work. And I put this down to the panel chairs, which I've been myself, and I've trained men in panel chairs. They simply haven't brought the panel together and actually practiced on real but not the live applications to make sure that they benchmark their judgments. So they haven't agreed, specific enough criteria. There are many other ways in which the panel can fall over themselves. So don't assume that they're perfect. They try their best, but so that number 4 is not out of scope. So let's see what you come up with on that poll question number 1. Okay, let's see if you've actually, okay, we've now got those options. This is really just to sort of get us into the mood for talking about feedback and what influences panels, whether it be at the SIFT or the interview stage. And you'll have your own views, I guess, about why you may have failed. But actually being honest with yourself about why you've failed and indeed succeeded is really important. And when I ask people, as I have done many times in the past, could you show me the feedback that you've had? I sometimes get just 5 or 6 lines from 2 or 3 interviews. That's it, total, half a page. And sometimes I get 2 pages where someone has itemized very specifically what they learnt, and they've cross-questioned the people giving them the feedback to try and nail it down to something very behavioural and specific enough. So if you had a go at that, let's see what kind of responses we get to launch us off. Okay, so we've got, didn't know how to go about changing my interview performance. Well, feedback was not specific enough. That's a worry, isn't it? What you want to know is what would I specifically need to have done differently? Why was if it was from the SIFT, why was one behaviour marked down much more than another one, or more than you had on a previous occasion when you submitted exactly the same examples? Don't know about behaving or changing your behaviour performance, so I hope I can contribute to that thought process today. Couldn't change my natural way, there's 8%, and then there's 10%, didn't agree with their assessment. Well, mercifully, that's a good sign that that's only 10%. Okay, well, let's go on. So step 6. Now, you may think this is odd, I don't know, but I put it in because I feel very strongly about this, that there's a big difference between the SIFT and the interview. I mean, you know how difficult it is, and when you don't get proper narrative feedback from the SIFT, it's hard to know what to do differently. I call it the party because, I mean, what you're trying to do at the SIFT is go get the appropriate scores. That means they can't leave you out of the interview process. But don't confuse that with getting the job as such. I mean, obviously, laying the foundations in what you write in an application for getting to the interview and what you'll talk about and add to and elaborate on at the interview. But it's, at the SIFT, you're just trying to get through. And I think that's important to bear in mind. And it's a complete mindset difference. The SIFT is about being above the line. By the line, that's a score of 4 or above gets you into the right territory. It may well be it's in numerical order, of course, and therefore 4s might not be enough. And of course, it's about creating a strong enough platform for the interview. So it's not unrelated to the interview. But you see, the so-called successfuls know they have to refocus their mindset onto the very different challenge of the interview. I cannot overemphasize this because it means that, you're thinking about the SIFT. So that's one stage. You just want to get through that. And in fact, I did suggest to you that you wouldn't want to be necessarily that adventurous, the SIFT stage. You've got to be specific and good examples, but you don't want to say put something in your application which you would need to elaborate on verbally, if you like, because you won't have the chance. They read it and that's it. The interview, on the other hand, is how you will stand out from the others. The SIFT, you're going to be up against a lot of people who won't make it. Whereas at the interview, all the shortlisted people will have been deemed able to do the job. At least they should have been. So the question changes completely, not above the line, but what would make you stand out compared to 3 or 4 or however many people it is who have also been summoned to the interview. And you're going to have to come up with a compelling difference that sets you apart, that might not be replicable in the other shortlisters. And that needs a bit of thinking. And it does mean that you need to refocus your whole approach to that different objective. And I think a lot of people don't do that. What they do is think, well, I got through the SIF, which was a miracle enough, if you like. Some people think it is. And you did that obviously did the trick. So therefore, they're going to do a talking version of that, if you like. That's not the case. You'll need to think about what is a compelling difference. And that isn't necessarily a silver bullet, a single sentence that completely rolls them over. This will be something that you did in a particular set of circumstances with a particular outcome, which shows you in a particular kind of light that stands you out from all the other shortlisters who have not had that experience, but maybe they have other compelling differences. So thinking that through is quite a challenge. And that's why I make it step number 6. Happy to answer questions on that if you want. Step 7. We haven't talked about behaviours, and the example I used this morning didn't include behaviours. By the way, behaviours are usually there below the SCS. You will find if you should apply ever at some stage in the not too distant future, we hope, to a senior civil service job, you will often find that they part company to some extent from the success profile system and may not include behaviours, may not even name them. Often they don't. So behaviours, though, can be there. And I said they can be, you could have written them as part of the application, or you could just go to be examined on them from scratch in the interview. I've developed over the years a series of tests. I call them tests because I've brought together panel members in many different government departments and taken the opportunity to say to them, when you actually are giving out, scoring, if you like, someone's 250 words on 2 or 3 or 4 behaviours, what are the kinds of things that lead you to give a high score? Let's say a 5 and above, or at least certainly a 4, but 5 and above. And these tests flow from that. The first one is the example relevant to the job or grade being applied for, to the job and the grade 7 being applied for? How close is it to that? Now, of course, the person hasn't been a grade 7, so they will have had to have an example to reach up into that sort of territory. But that's quite an important test. The second one may seem a little odd. Does it reflect the narrative for that behaviour? I discovered a few years ago that when you've got something like making effective decisions, which is one behaviour, I noticed that when people gave me examples of that, they very often didn't use the word decision, which I thought was very odd. Why would you not call something a decision? So therefore, you have to make sure that in your example you reinforce in the narrative, the narrative for that behaviour, so they know what you're talking about. It may seem unnecessary, but you're sort of trying to drive the nails in of your example. Thirdly, and I referred to this before lunch, does it represent a genuine challenging situation for you? This is the I bit, as well as the we bit for the team. I've got it over the years had examples. I get really tired of seeing these where you find that someone's written something and they say, so we had a problem with so-and-so and so-and-so, and we communicated with the stakeholders and had a meeting with them at which we worked out an action plan, which over the following 2 months we implemented, and it was successful. And when someone writes something like that, I always say to them, well, we've learned absolutely nothing. You've told us the facts, but you haven't told us the process, because that's what they're trying to judge. How do you think about something? How do you decide about it? How do you make a judgment about it? How cautious are you? How adventurous are you? And so on. So that has to be in the example. And that gets to number 4. It's not just challenging it, but when you thought about it and handled it, do we get a sense of why it was challenging? What were the risks? What were the pushbacks? Why did you reject one approach rather than another one? Did it lead to a clear outcome? And this is a bit odd, not necessarily a huge success. Over the years, I've got pretty fed up with reading examples that have been sort of cleaned up specifically for an interview. So it all seems wonderfully worked out. Everyone sort of, goes over the horizon into the sunset, all happy. Not quite. It's not quite as fairy tale as that. But you know what I mean? It all sounds a bit too polished, as though they've buffed it up specifically for the interview process. The successfuls, and I'm sorry I keep referring to successfuls, they are hugely amorphous and different people who've struggled and so on. They're not a homogenous group by any chance. But many of the people who've been successful, don't describe it in those terms. It will be a much more grubby, realistic kind of outcome. So they might say, this was partially successful and in one or two important areas, such as this, that, and the other. However, we learned some important things about which we were able in subsequent occasions to improve on. So you get a sense of this being real, like real life. So you've got to make your outcomes real. Using active and memorable words that draw the reader into the action. This is, this may sound, this is not just a question of use of English, but it is the way in which both in the application and in the interview, you use words which stay with the panel, that they remember. And I'll show you an example of that in due course. Don't use those boring verbs that I referred to this morning. You want the reader, if it's for the application, to still have your words ringing around their brain when they're attempting to read the next one in the pile, if you like. You want them to think, oh, that's interesting, that needs following up, or that's rather surprising, but gratifying to hear something like that. I'd like to know more. And then the last one, which is the point that came up in the questions before lunch. What does it say about what you can offer wider organization with wider organizational implications? So this isn't just a one-off star-based example that only applies to those unique circumstances in that organization, in that job at that time. You've actually chosen an example which has got applicability wider in that original department. It may even be picked up by more senior management and used again somewhere else, but has got applicability in particular to the job that you're applying for. And in fact, those that have got used to this process and have been quite successful will often say in the interview, and I chose that example because I think if I've interpreted it correctly, that challenge exists in this job. They will literally bridge into a discussion about its applicability to the job they're applying for. So you've got 7 tests there. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that you would hit all those bases, all 7, but you can see why it would make for something which is more impressive. You can actually take a behavior example you've got, and I suggest you do, and see how far one that you got perhaps a poor score for in a previous application and one that you've got a higher score in, and have a look and see how many of those 7 would have applied to it. And the proof of the pudding comes in here, because this is an actual example which is real. It's absolutely verbatim, exactly as it was put in. It is, of course, a senior civil service example, and don't be put off by that, because I just happen to find it because it's a good example of what I'm talking about here. But you could just as easily be at an HEO or SEO level, but I think the picture comes a bit clearer with this example. So if you had a chance just for a moment to read your way down there, I'm not suggesting it's a great example of making effective decisions, but it's not bad, and this person did get promoted. Not just because of this particular example. So when you've had a chance to get to the end of that, I'm going to show you it again, only I have edited it. So you can see it's got a number of those ingredients I've just been talking about in this list here. And so what I've done and I'm not going to go through it because you can read it for yourself. I've put in square brackets a reference to not all the 7, but just a number of them that seem to me to be part and parcel of the way this person made the case for making effective decisions with a star-based example. And the most important point is that the person who gave this example had never seen my 7 tests. He had intuitively wrote the example in that way. And I'm inviting you to think in that kind of way because it is more likely to attract a better score. Now, a further way of taking examples to new heights, which I hinted at before lunch, is this. You're very used to situation, task, action, result, and even though there are many other versions of STARS, I can think of at least 7 or 8, this is the one that has been embraced by the civil service for many years now. You don't have to use it, but it's a good way of producing the old saying in the advert goes, tell us about a time when you, and then you write an STAR kind of example. What may be not so used to in your world is the percentages that I've applied there, which are kind of bracketed because they're not precise. It's just to indicate what I think might be the broad division of the, let's say, 250 words that you'd use. So the situation is only going to be a very small amount, 5-10%. There are a lot of people who fall into the trap of they can't resist writing a lot about context. So you get buckets of background, which the panel ignore. They don't need that, just a sentence or 2 at most. What they are interested in is what the challenge was, and that's the thing I talked about. So that 10 to 15% is crucial, a statement which captures why you were having to solve this problem. Then 50 to 60%, half plus, is on how you thought about it, what you could have done, what the risks might be, etc., followed by the result. How did you bring it into land and how did it work out? And preferably with some clear evidence. But what, of course, if you were to add a couple of things, and a decade or so ago, I added this, learned and transferability. And what that means is, well, as it suggests, you're not just describing factually the STAR. You're then saying, so what did we learn? What did I learn from that experience? In other words, what does that tell you about me and the way I operate? And transferability is how you make the links with the job you're applying for. So somebody who's learned a thing or 2 about how to do this, the successfuls, as I call them, would be likely to say in the interview what we learned about it. And as a result of that, I think, if I got it correctly, that the job I'm applying for, and were you to appoint me here, I think it's quite likely that I feel that we would come up against problems such as X, Y, and Z. And you've seen from my example how I handled it. And therefore you could be assured that I would be able to bring that to the new tasks. So they talk about how it would transfer. I call those 2 things, by the way, that's how it makes Starlet. I call that the sort of gold standard of a good behavior example. You could apply it, of course, to essential criteria as well, if you like. If you want to do those in a star-based approach. This isn't just me inventing this. The Scottish government, and Emma will probably be able to authenticate this, actually has taken this, and they call it reflection. So when you're asked for a behavioural example like this, star-based, then you need to reflect on it, and they prompt you to do that, and that's what I mean by learned and transferability. So it's the golden thread through this, because I think when you're in the interview, You may not have a chance to write about learned transferability in your example with just your 250 words, but you can certainly do that in the interview. And in particular, if you've written the 250 words beforehand and you're going to be taken into more depth in the interview with the panel. You may want to ask me some questions about that. Step 8, 2 more to go. So we've now got to the stage of thinking about the interview. How many on time? It's okay. What is the panel actually looking for? Quite often, departments do actually set out in the blurb which comes with the advert what they say they're looking for. I've distilled this over the years with lots of different versions of that down to just a few things. I mean, you may not agree with me, but I think my first is, what's the panel looking for, whether it explicitly acknowledges this or not? They're looking for reassurance over the risk of you stepping up to the next grade. There's always a risk of you stepping up to the next grade. You may not have had experience of the particular work in that. You may have not managed a team that's as big as that one because it's a promotion. You may have had not enough experience of dealing with ministers, or you're very operational, or you're moving from a technical area into a more generalist policy area, etc., etc. So the panel, wants to, whether their questioning or their discussion afterwards will be around that risk. What you don't want to be is gonged out on a wet Tuesday morning because they've taken a view that you're a bit too typecast or you don't have enough experience of ministers. What you do need to do is, in your preparation and what you write up, to be aware of those risks. So you want to be your own self-critic. What would be the most vulnerable area of my application for this job? Where is the area where I'm most at risk of rejection because the panel won't be reassured enough to take that risk? They want a believable pitch for the job, and that's the point I made about outcomes and doing things in a very realistic, not overly polished, overly idealistic way. I call it grubby sometimes, that the panel can see that you were there, you did it. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And then, of course, the panel has the job as an interview panel to the panel chair to write down in a box their rationale, their written rationale for why they have scored you higher than other candidates. And your job is to find ways of using phrases and evidence in the interview that they can steal from you. And I've often been in an interview situation where a candidate has said something and the panel chair alongside me is sort of nodding as though to say, yes, well, that's good. I can use that as a way of summarizing this particular candidate. You will often get a presentation at this level for grade 7. You may have already had that experience as well. 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and the subject matter of that presentation will be given to you if you get through the SIFT. And it may be a policy one. It might be more even personal than that, but very often is a policy challenge in the job. So you've got to be able to do your homework. You usually won't be able to use slides. So it's not a bad idea thinking about it in slides. 1 or 2 slides, possibly only one, will be enough for 5 minutes. So you're going to have to do a talking version of that. And you really do have to stick to the time limits. I worked with someone not so long ago, a couple of years back, who she said to me, "Oh, well, I've timed it and it's only 5 minutes and 25, and I can cut that down. That's easy." So I said, "No, I want to hear it." So she did it, and it was over 7 minutes when she actually delivered it. So don't just look at the thing, time it and try it out. And remember, of course, however nervous and how much you don't like doing presentations, it's your free go at this. They won't interrupt you. You've got 5 minutes to say why you're the best candidate. And that's the important thing. Never forget your candidacy in this. Don't get lost in answering the policy subject It's not subject related, it's candidate related. And in fact, you'll hear good candidates say, well, and in fact, that's why I've applied for this job. I'll say that in the presentation because I think my answer to your question here relates to why I believe I'm a good candidate. What do the successful therefore do actually in the interview? Well, they will not tend to come with their sort of fingers crossed invisibly behind their back, that they're hoping that they'll get the right questions. They will have interviewed, in inverted commas, themselves, or got somebody to interview them beforehand, and they will have demonstrated that they can handle the occasion with somebody who isn't going to give them an easy time, not a friendly boss who just, tells them that they're good and so on and gives them. They need to be really tested. And in fact, you can test yourself by thinking of what would be all the difficult areas that things that you would probably prefer they didn't ask, but are likely to come up. Like, for example, you've only ever managed 3 staff, but this job will involve 8 or 10. And how you're going to bridge that gap. I think that sort of came up in one of the questions this morning to one of the other speakers. And the people who do well at this walk towards the difficult stuff. They do not try and get through 45 minutes hoping that they won't get asked the difficult stuff. They will say, in reading my application, you might have drawn the provisional conclusion that I don't have enough team management experience. And that's when you'll deploy the work shadowing, the deputizing, the things that we were talking about in the question period this morning. Evidence-based influence rather than candidate. They will recognize that they are in the business of having a convincing evidence base for their candidacy. It's not a personality contest as such. And therefore, they will be practicing deploying their good examples. Remember what I said this morning, people get through these on the quality of their examples. They like to talk about real world impact. So, you may be working right in the sort of depths of the engine room of this whole policy area, not really in touch with the real world, but to the extent when you get to going for grade 7, if you can translate your bit of the of the cog machine into what impact or effect or implications that got for how the policy will work on the ground, so much the better. Behind that is the idea that candidates who are as happy to talk upwardly at grade 7 and 6, and particularly in the senior civil service, as well as downwardly, is what they're looking for. And I think that's what Sandra was talking about this morning, being able to have that wider upward and outward. Instead, what you get is a lot of people at SEO and HO are really good at talking about their teams, and they run teams extremely well, but they always look a bit iffier when they're talking upwardly into what keeps directors awake at night. So that's the point I'm making here. So I think that's not everything you can say about that. There's more I want to say right now before we have some questions, but that's the essence of what I think the success will do. What I've done, we're doing on time, is I've got 2 slides here, which when you see these question marks, what they represent are, if you like, competencies for interviewees. So if you can look at these 2 slides and say, yes, this should guide my preparation for the interview. First of all, and this is taken on the basis of what do candidates get through interviews, what do they have in common? Well, one is that they will try and score points early. You might not get the luxury of being asked, why are you applying for this job, or what do you think is at the heart of this job? They may go straight into a behaviour or whatever. But you want to be extremely clear why you're applying for a job and why you, what is it you bring that is special and different, that compelling thing. And if you get the chance to say something pointedly about that at the start. Hearing your own voice early and without too much umming and ahhing. I know that's very easy to say and more difficult to do. Pitched at the right level, as close to the level you want to be as an SEO or HEO giving grade 7-ish type answers. Personal achievements, you don't have to cover yourself in wonderful adjectives as to what personal qualities you've got. You can talk about your strengths, but use examples to do it. You could say, one of the strengths is that is being able to bounce back when things are not going well, extent of my resilience. And I think I do that. Let me give you an example of that. In other words, you've thought through concrete on the ground examples for the strengths that you have. Modeling what they want. You can't model project management in the room, but you can certainly model clear communication. So they will be looking for people who don't get locked into answering one question from one person on the panel. The owner of the question is not necessarily the owner of the answer. So the so-called successfuls will talk to the whole panel. Modeling too, because you'll see that the example I picked this morning was one there where there's going to be what I call a trade test. They're going to ask you to do or demonstrate something in the room live. That's the time when, you can welcome things like that, because that should be on your home territory where you're not going to just talk about what you do. You're actually going to do it. And panels like that, if they can do. I think a lot of people get sort of freaked out about appropriate body language and eye contact. They get very worried that they've got particular sort of mannerisms that are going to be off-putting. I really don't think that people need to worry about it. I think it just freaks people out to get concerned about stuff like that. What I often say to people is nothing too kind of odd. Odd is having too much stillness, in the sense that I have seen people who have their hands as though they've been arrowdited to the desk in front of them without moving. I have seen people who, bounce around in the chair. As long as it's nothing rhythmic, sort of they're scratching their ear, rhythmically and so on, that can look a bit odd. But apart from that, you can be relatively eccentric with your body language, and it's okay, provided what you're saying makes sense. Strengths I've talked about. Taking the initiative, examples and evidence. Good interviewees won't wait for the panel to say, can you give us an example? They'll say, let me give you an example. They will make the panel stop them if they're up against the time. And then being memorable and making an impact. I've got an example of that, and I'll show you that in just a minute. The last one is really important. Your test of your readiness for an interview is, let's say this won't happen to you, but let's say you walked into the interview and the chair said, we're not going to give you a 45-minute interview. You've got 3 minutes to set out why you think you're the best candidate. That won't happen, of course, but the test is, could you do it if you were asked to? Would you be able to say, well, I think there are 4 challenges as I read it in this particular job. They're this, A, B, C, and D. I meet A because B, and in other words, you could squash it all down into those 3 minutes and you could deliver it. And I'm here to tell you that I reckon that 2/3 of the people that I've worked with over the years, probably more than that, would fail that test, even though they've slaved over their CV and so on. They haven't cranked the handle of preparation enough. So you're not going to have to do that. But the idea that you've got a story, a sort of composite of your credentials that you've got evidence for, and see it like a series of hooks that haven't got anything hanging on them, and what you're going to do is to use their questions to hang things on those hooks. Being memorable. Have a read of that. That's real, and it's somebody who got a grade 7. It might even be a 7 to a 6 job. I can't remember. But when I first showed that, it's a few years ago now, I remember the group of people that were there said, "Oh, I don't think I could say that. It seems very critical of ministers," and so on. This is what I mean by taking risks. Sometimes you have to say things as they really are. And on that particular occasion, I said to the people who looked doubtful in the audience, "But how many of you had an occasion in ministers like that?" And a lot of hands went up. So clearly they knew what a grueling occasion was. The question is, can you name it? And in fact, the use of that term grueling, I can almost promise you that adjective stayed in the minds of the panel. And that's what I suggest you try and do. And the last one, coming over as themselves. You heard this word authenticity used a lot, but I want to make it very clear to you. This probably is the most, apart from the point about examples, what actually does help you at this occasion of the interview. Well, what doesn't help you is seeing it as an intellectual occasion where there's a set of criteria and you're there to match it, and you're wrestling on the inside of your head to try and pull out all the examples you've mugged up over the last few days. And I've seen this many times before. I've been there in a panel, and I can see the candidate is not really having a relationship with us as a panel. They're having a relationship with a sort of pretend filing cabinet in their head that they're scrambling through to try and dig up the examples that they so polished up the other night. The so-called successfuls don't do that. They, by and large, will let the preparation go, maybe even a few days before. They don't, whatever they do, they don't, unless there is a very good reason, take a day off before their interview. They very often will hope they have an incredibly busy morning, so they come into the interview with no kind of preparation, nerves and anxiety washing through them. The panel want to see the real thing, but they often don't. In other words, they want to see someone who looks like a grade 7. So, and what does someone looking like a grade 7? This is somebody who realizes this process is from the heart so much as, well, that's not necessarily the head. The head's involved, but they're modeling passion and commitment and understanding, and they are relating to the panel as though they were peers. They've let go of the preparation and examples on the basis that they trust that those will come to mind when it comes to it. But this is a relational task that you're about to go to, not an intellectual matching task. And I think that therefore is why I end with this wonderful quote from Oscar Wilde. And I, over the years I've done this, I've seen many people who've said to me, I had my best occasion in front of a panel when I'd just come back from having flu or something, or we'd had a terrible sort of crisis at work and I was so busy, or I just hadn't had enough time to do it. I just went in there and just, went for it, whatever that might mean. So, by all means, preparation is crucial. But the important thing is they want to see someone who cuts down that risk, who looks and feels and sounds like a grade 7. And this isn't that difficult to do, because if you doubt your ability to do this, I've tested this out. People who've said to me they're really very nervous, and these are amongst friends or acquaintances of mine, when we've been, not with lots of alcohol inside us, but in a pub or in a social occasion, I say to them something like, what tells you that you've been a successful civil servant, or I ask them about their job. They are incredibly fluent. When they're relaxed, they can do it. It's all there. The question is, can they do it when it's in these test environments? There's a lot more that I could say, and I've tried to summarize it, but I think my task was to give you in those 9 steps things that would tip things in your favor. And I'd be willing to bet that for most of you, you'll cast your eye down that list and you'll think, I really don't do that terribly well, or I've not had a good time with that, or whatever, or I haven't even thought of that. Okay, final poll question, and then we can have some questions. Would you like to have a go at that? I'm hoping that I've lifted your sense of potential success up a little. See, even I can't write in grammar. As an G7. I don't know why I wrote that. Never mind. Proofreading is important.
Oh, well, looks like you've had a successful session there, Richard, with over
Yes.
reassured. And
I'm just
7.1
waiting.
give me an interview tomorrow. That's very impressive.
Oh, yeah. Give me an interview tomorrow. I have had one or two people. I have also had people who say, worryingly, I have got an interview tomorrow.
Oh, well, this is the best way to spend the day before.
And I'm willing to bet that there's somebody on this call that's certainly got an interview within the next few days.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I'm hoping those scores are going to come up, and then you can use the rest of the 10 minutes or so to see what questions people have got. We're nearly there, I think. I hope.
There we go.
All ended. Here we go. Well, reassured, 50%. Okay. I'm glad you 40% say you've got a lot of work to do. It was part of my objective to slightly depress you, not really depress you, make you feel it. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe there's a bit more work for me to do on this. That's good. Taking this process seriously. You can't just see an advert and go bowling into the interview 2 weeks later and expect, without, preparation. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And only 1.7% are more direct. So that's great. Okay, we'll move on to questions. We've got quite a few in, but again, if anyone has any questions that's come to them, please just add them into the Q&A function. So we'll start with Medva's question. And they say, at example stage, I've often been advised to use 2 different examples for application and interview. Have you any views on this? As you referenced, using the same in both gives room to go into further detail, covering them with the L&T elements of Starlet.
Yes, I mean, this is a very good question. I just think, you probably won't like me to say, I think it's not a bad idea to have 2 strings to your bow. Sometimes there'll be something which is, because sometimes the question is about something that's quite big in your job. It's a big thing. So it can withstand having multiple questions asked about it. Very often what we do isn't just one question and it's done and dusted, the answer. So, and I think you can also have some contrast too. You can have something that is undoubtedly a good success and you'll use that in your behavior. But then you might have something where you've learnt a lot or that has enormous implications for what should happen at grade 7 level or relations with the senior civil service. So you don't have to have worked that out and certainly not to have written it out, but to have it there so you don't get surprised. So worth thinking about 2 or 3 of your behaviours or 2 of the 3 of the really important essential criteria to have more than one example. Yeah.
Okay, super. Thank you. The next question is from an anonymous delegate, and I think probably something that a lot of people have had experience of. Sorry, the question's just jumped a bit here, but I will get it back up. Yes, here we go. Can nerves impact a score given during the interview? If I'm presenting examples of being a competent and effective communicator, but that doesn't always show during the process, could that show up negatively in the
Well, I think if I were to say no, you wouldn't believe me. So the answer is yes, it could.
Well, any tips on getting around that then?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, which is that if you go for an SCS job, which I know you're way off yet, but very often they have to do a staff engagement exercise. exercise where they're put in front of a whole bunch of people, where they are literally being tested about their capacity to handle an occasion confidently or reasonably confidently. I think the fact is most panels realise that this is a somewhat nerve-wracking occasion. But you are anchored by your examples. I want you to think, I'm dying to talk to them about X, because it's a good story. And that doesn't have to be a stunning success. It could be something where we learnt a lot. So you want to, in your preparation, to have perhaps got 3 or 4 things you hope you can hitch your wagon to and talk about. And as far as nerves are concerned, I genuinely believe that it's a good idea not to sweat beforehand. Have a very busy thing to do and then go off to the interview and just go in without actually having lots of time to develop an anxious background to it. Although I have to say, there are people for whom, and some of you will know this, can do the job, but they can't do the selection process. So they're TP'd forever.
Okay, so we'll move on to another question, again from an anonymous delegate, which I think is actually a really useful question that a lot of people will find helpful. What are some good questions to ask the panel at an interview when they get to the stage of saying, do you have any questions for us?
I'm not sure whether you're going to like this. None.
None, okay.
That's not quite true. There are 2 kinds of questions that I would not ask. One is the smart ask question. The one that says, I noticed that your business plan says this, that, and the other, but your strategic plan last year said this. Well, how could we reconcile those 2 things? This is really someone who's trying to, at the end of the interview, come over as really clever. Perhaps because they haven't actually felt they've done very well in the interview. Don't ask a big ticket question right at the end. The time to ask that is before you come to the interview, before you write your application. And the other kind of question not to ask is, the job is in Cardiff and I live in West London. Would I be able to travel down on a Monday morning and travel back on a Friday afternoon? Wait till they offer you the job before you go into that kind of territory. I know I'm slightly, Mickey taking here, but, unless there's a really good reason, let's say in the answer I gave about X, I did want to just make it clear. Something that's really important that slipped your mind. But do bear in mind, the panel is almost certainly knocking on the time thing and they need to get on.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. We've got another question from an anonymous user. And they've said, as somebody with ADHD, preparation is key, but I struggle with memory retention, especially with nerves. So I've had to write things down on cue cards, which can then seem a bit less authentic on stage.
Yeah.
So do you have any tips regarding that at an interview?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I'm going to answer this question in the broader context of neurodiversity or other disabilities and so on. I mean, we are used to reasonable adjustments. Many people don't realize that you can declare your need for reasonable adjustments without having to go into great depth about the precise reasons why. And you want to look on the intranet or the internet site for most departments. The one I'm most familiar with is Department of Business and Trade, which goes into a lot of detail where, people may meet the panel beforehand. They may have the questions in advance. They may use a laptop. There may be a whole raft of reasonable things. The important thing is to be clear-cut. Clear-cut about what the nature of the support you need is, but also to overcome your reticence for declaring it. Departments bend over backwards to try and make sure that people with disabilities or other kinds of reasons could be very broad ranging, makes it difficult for them to cope with an interview. And they don't have to go into serious diagnoses to do that. And so a lot of people struggle on. And I say to people, unless there are good reasons to struggle on, don't, because the reasonable adjustments are there to be taken and to be used.
Yeah, and if they're not being implemented effectively, you should speak to your trade union about that as well.
Absolutely, quite
From the
correct.
FTA there. Okay, so I think we've got time for one last question, and again, this is from an anonymous delegate. I have provided an example of a partial success historically as an example, and been told that under no circumstances should I use it. It must have a clear deliverable. So this is them using an example which doesn't have a clear deliverable and which is a partial success. Would you
Yeah,
advise the use?
yeah, this is a tricky one because a lot of people, it very often happens at EO level, possibly HO level too, they're part of the machine. They only do part of the work. The thing only comes to fruition once it hits grade 7 level. So how do they make something that is a sort of staging post in a broader picture sound like an outcome with real, and that is a bit of a problem. But I think having something deliverable, or should I say, saying something very clear about deliverability and so on, even if it is only these are the milestones in a much bigger project. I can remember years ago being involved in lots of interviews for universal credit, for example, which is an absolutely enormous policy. And most of the time, people are dealing with very small subsets of success within an enormous 2 or 3 year program of change. The same goes for HMRC's digital transformation at the moment. But there are still deliverables. Under no circumstances should I use it. I don't agree with that. I think there are circumstances in which you'll need to use it, but you've got to be able to say something clever. What can we learn from that? What were the implications for what was going to be the next stage after that? In what shape did you deliver what you did that would have helped, hindered, compromised the ultimate deliverability? Those are all examples of talking about deliverability without actually saying the whole thing was brought into land perfectly and everyone lived happily ever after. I'm afraid we don't live in that world. But I acknowledge this is tricky.
Yeah. Okay, Richard, thank you so much. I think that's us out of time for this session, and I'm sure everyone's taken away a lot from those two sessions actually. And yeah, as I said earlier, the slides will be shared next week, and you'll also get the video as well. So anything that you missed, you'll be able to catch up on. And thank you for everyone
Can I
that's
just say thank you very much for coming along, and you will get the slides. And I can assure you that there's a lot of things I've talked about that do definitely work. It's a question of whether you've got the appetite to go and give it a go. I hope you do. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so we'll bring this session to a close, and please be taking a short comfort break now until 2:45. So we've got 15 minutes. So if you go away and just have a little break now, again, close this session and come back on the live now session for the next one. And the next session is titled Leading from the Middle, a Toolkit for Positioning Yourself as a Leader. So that'll be led by Katie Driver, who is the founding director of Abounding Solutions. Okay, so we'll see you at 2:45. Thanks. Bye.